Hello, everyone. This is Angie from TechServe Alliance. Welcome to today's webinar. Are you ready to propel your growth with M&A? The key steps to getting started in M&A for staffing executives. There will be a question and answer session following the presentation, so please write any questions you want answered in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. We are also recording today's presentation, which will be available on the TechServe Alliance website and distributed to in follow-up emails. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Martin Borosco, Managing Partner at Becker.
Thanks, Angie. A pleasure being here. Interesting, because usually when I'm doing these presentations, we're talking more on the sales side of mergers and acquisitions. So this is a little bit different and exciting for me. I hope the audience enjoys it as well. And our topic is, using mergers and acquisitions as a key tool in your arsenal to help grow your staffing firm. And we're going to try and look at this, for folks who are thinking about making their first acquisition or whether or not they should make acquisitions. And there's certainly going to be a lot of content aimed at those folks. But there's going to also be some places where I think we're going to dive in pretty deep. And for those folks who have made acquisitions, even who are serial acquirers, I think you'll get some benefit from this as well. And in particular, I think folks are going to benefit because of the panel that I'm getting a chance to speak with today, which I'm very excited about. First off, of course, is John Larson. If you don't know John, I'll be surprised. But John is obviously a industry veteran and runs TechServe's M&A marketplace. John, it's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Thanks, Marty. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Yes, I'm looking forward to interacting with you on this topic. And then, everyone knows that UHY Advisors is a major player in the tech staffing industry. And I've had the pleasure of working with Jeremy on a number of occasions on transactions and his team over at UHY. Like Becker, UHY really focuses in on the staffing industry and spends time in the space. And Jeremy, it's a pleasure to have you on board today.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, excited as well. This is a very interesting topic. I think for anyone that follows the financial press or you see it in your businesses, there's a lot going on in staffing in general and M&A in general. And, I think you could do this webinar every month or so, and it'd be a little bit of a different theme and story. So yeah, excited for today. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And obviously, this is a very broad topic, so we can't cover soup to nuts about acquisitions. That would take a conference all to itself, honestly, to even try to tackle that. So we're going to hit some areas that we think are key, that are good for areas for beginners, intermediate, and veterans in acquisitions. And we're going to start off, I think, with an overview of what the marketplace looks like. Then we're going to get into acquisition strategy. We're going to get into search strategies, and then we're going to get into target evaluation. And John, I don't think there's anybody better to kick us off with respect to what does the IT tech staffing space marketplace look like today than you. So maybe you can share some insight on what the market looks like today.
Thank you, Marty. Be glad to do that. The market is still hot. There's still a lot of activity especially in the IT, and I think in some of the other sectors also, still good acquisition activity taking place. So I still see plenty of buyers out there, plenty of sellers. And to the comment of the topic today, I'm seeing new buyers enter the marketplace. So there are folks that are taking a look at it and saying, okay, I think this is an opportunity. Now, relative to maybe what's happened in the past, I'll say 6 months. There's a little more uncertainty in the marketplace. It really hasn't changed the valuations. We're still seeing the enterprise value remain solid. What I am noticing is a change in the terms. So, and I think that's relative to the risk. As we have some economic uncertainty, I don't think industry uncertainty, but just general macroeconomic uncertainty, that's introduced a little bit of risk into the profile of the marketplace. And as a result, we're seeing some adjustment in in the terms of a transaction, not so much in the enterprise value, but in the terms. So I think that's going to continue. We anticipate that for, well into next year.
When you talk about the terms, I imagine, for at least from what I'm seeing, and since we're on the buy side today, they're shifting a little bit more favorable to buyers. Was that fair to say, John?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. The buyers naturally in any transaction, they want to mitigate their risk as much as possible. And I think the economics of the day are causing them to really kind of adjust that, the whole transaction aspect post sale. What do we do to de-risk our situation based upon the economics?
And then I'll shift it over to Jeremy. So is one of the primary shifts you're seeing in cash at close versus earnouts? Is that one of the primary shifts you're seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, it really is. And I think the way the two of you just kind of set that up, which is it's a shift, I think, in favor of the buyer. And I think that's important because cash at close is a big one, right? And so if I'm a buyer, I want to, one of the best ways to de-risk or mitigate risk on a deal is, put 50% cash at close, which, by the way, has been standard in staffing historically as kind of a starting point, 50 to 60%. And the rest gets paid out over time, maybe a year or two or three as an earnout, right? And so, while historically staffing M&A has been, these deals have been getting closed at 50 to 60% cash at close, buyers have been competing not just on value in the last 12 months or so, but also on cash at close. I've seen deals where, buyers are paying a half a turn or a turn higher than maybe what the intrinsic value of the business is. And instead of 50 to 60% cash at close, I think in the first three deals, worked on quite a few of those with Marty as well. First three deals of this year in staffing, cash at close was 90 to 100%, right? And that means no escrow in some of those deals as well. So that really puts buyers in a tough position. And so I think the shift is probably similar to housing. I think it's been very difficult to be a buyer in this market because, you have to compete on value. You have to compete with aggressive deal terms to win these deals, assuming a competitive process. And that puts buyers in a tough position. I think similar to housing where, as a first-time home buyer, you're out there and you've got lines a mile long at these open houses. I think that's changed with interest rates a bit. Again, it's not getting easier to buy a home, and I think it's still difficult as a buyer out there. But I think at the margin, we're seeing a little bit of a shift in cooling on some of that frenzied, aggressive behavior of other buyers in the marketplace. Probably the way I position it.
Yeah, I think that's what I've been seeing as well. I mean, we did have a deal in the IT staffing space that we closed about 40 days ago, and it was still 100% cash at close, and it was a significant size deal. There's still some aggressiveness in the economics, but I'm starting to see a subtle shift as well in the deals that we have. So I think that sets the tone for where we are today. I think in terms of the marketplace, it's shifting maybe towards a little bit more friendly to buyers. Certainly still crowded marketplace. As John indicated, we have a lot of new buyers. I'd say, post-COVID, we've had a lot of new buyers in the marketplace as compared to historically. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about acquisition strategy. And that's the starting point. Are you going to acquire? Why are you going to acquire? Maybe I'll start off here. So, why are you going to acquire? It's kind of a multifaceted question. At its very simplest form, the reason folks make acquisitions is to drive up the value of their company, right? I mean, that's the simplest form for why you make acquisitions. And if you look at most of the major players in the IT staffing space, almost without exception, they've all made acquisitions and made multiple acquisitions. And if you go from broader and you look at the staffing industry in general, that fact remains true, right? If you look at the outside of of IT and you look at healthcare, you look at light industrial, you look at professional, most of the major players have made acquisitions. And then if you step outside of our little world of staffing, I don't know if there is another world out there, but let's assume there's another world outside of the staffing industry. I hear that most of the major players in these other industries have made acquisitions too. So the question is why? Well, why do most of the major players in industries make acquisitions? And I think the bottom line is that at some point it's hard to continue to grow organically. And you get to a point where growth is hard to come by. And the only way that you can help accelerate or stimulate that or supplement that is through making acquisitions. So to me, that's one end of it. And then there's secondary reasons to make acquisitions as well. And to hit that bottom line, I mean, I've seen a lot of our clients make acquisitions to get into new territories, which is an obvious one, to provide supplemental services. Interesting change in the overall marketplace in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago, nobody wanted anybody who was recruiting. They all wanted contingent workforce, right? Now there's been a big shift. Recruiting is proven to be incredibly valuable. The value of recruiting firms has gone up. And so now I see a lot of my clients who had focused so much on contingent side of their making acquisitions of recruiting firms, perm recruiting firms. So sometimes you want to round out your services. You want to get talent. It's hard to find talent today, right? Marketplace for talent is very difficult. And I'm not going to say an easy way because there's nothing easy about acquisitions, but one of the benefits of making acquisitions is a lot of time you pick up some talent. So John, I'll throw it over to you. What are some of your whys as to why people should consider making acquisitions?
Well, I want to piggyback off what you just said about talent. The financials are the foundation for an acquisition. Can I increase value in the firm? Value does accrue to scale as a general rule. And but the teams, we're finding more and more often as buyers are looking, to acquire, they're looking at the team just as hard as the financials. What do they have in the way of professional salespeople, professional recruiters? What's their infrastructure like relative to those processes? So that's become more critical in my mind than in the past. Very, very hard, as you said, to find good internal talent within the industry. I think another reason that buyers take a look at is relative to the clients. Oftentimes or sometimes it's to service the client. They may have they may be at a headquarters location. They need to support regional locations for that large client. So I see that occasionally. Sometimes if I'm a smaller acquirer, I'm a smaller buyer, sometimes it's to reduce my client concentration. So as I acquire a company, I'm going to add new clients. And as a result, that reduces my client concentration, which, as I think most of us know, that's I'll say a negative or a risk factor on both the seller and the buyer side. So I think that's another reason that people are looking at acquisitions.
Thanks, John. Jeremy, anything to add on why, or if you want to shift to how folks should start to think about their acquisition strategy and formulate that?
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of the main topics. I mean, one of the things I was going to say, which is I think you covered a lot of the whys, right? But for every company, there's a set of whys out there. And so I think, if you're thinking about embarking on an acquisition strategy, probably one of the, my biggest kind of recommendations is invest in the criteria identification process, right? It's step number one. It's a lot of management teams, business owners, they think, well, I've already know these 3 organizations, they'd be a great fit. Let me just pick up the phone and call the owner and see if I can get things going. But what I recommend is pausing first, sit down with your team, right? Get a lot of input into this process, get it on the whiteboard. What geographies do we want to enter? Which do we need to enter competitively? Which do we want to avoid for various reasons? John talked about the team, right? Are we okay if the current management and ownership team are looking to kind of move on in the next year and we're going to kind of fill in around them? Or do we need somebody that's going to stick around for the next 3 years? So I guess the point there is invest in the criteria process, figure out all those aspects. What are the must-haves and what are the nice-to-haves, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're too particular in what you're looking for, there may not be any firms that exactly fit what you're looking for. There might be a very small subset. On the other hand, if you're too broad, it can be a very distracting, time-consuming, and frustrating process to kind of make all these phone calls, all these outreaches. So I think spending time on the criteria process, find out what's critical, what's important, what's nice to have. John, you mentioned geographically, right? So there might be a geography you want to enter. And I have a lot of times where our clients on the buy side, they're looking up flights, right? How easy is it to fly from my current location to this location? Is there a 2-hour drive time off the airport? It might sound kind of nuanced, but how can I successfully manage that enterprise post-closing? That's really critical. So I think before you start kind of figuring out how do I start approaching these groups, I think that criteria phase is really critical. And I think getting a lot of buy-in and input from a broader team is a really important part of the buy side process.
Yeah, I want to stay right there because I think that is critical because that rolls into the target evaluation, right? We're going to talk about target evaluation. Well, how the heck do you evaluate a target if you don't know what the criteria is that you're evaluating by, right? So John, please, continue on what Jeremy's talking about setting the criteria and the strategy.
Well, I think it's a matter also, once you set that, to have the discipline to follow through. Oftentimes buyers or sellers, they don't have the discipline internally. They want to chase the newest shiny object, or this sounds great. I think Jeremy is right on target. And set your criteria, do it with your team, and then be disciplined in doing that. And also, your strategy may be totally different than somebody else's. So that's the reason you need to know your company very well and understand what is it that we're really looking for. Aside from the financials are still the foundation of it, but aside from that, what are the other components that'll make it a successful acquisition and accomplish the business objectives that my team or our team has set out to achieve?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think for those folks who are either thinking about whether they should be making acquisitions or maybe have made one acquisition, to me, I think it's critical to understand that, at least in my opinion, with an acquisition strategy, it's kind of the old saying, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound, right? Most folks are going to make multiple acquisitions. It takes multiple acquisitions usually to accomplish your strategy, right? To meet those criteria, usually if you're doing a territory or a service ad or an industry ad, it takes multiple acquisitions to really accomplish what your goal is going to be. And it's also a little bit of a numbers game. I hate to say it, but I got the pleasure of working for, I think, 8 industry firms that are what I would call serial acquirers and have been involved, helping them through the acquisition process. And whenever I talk to them, post the acquisition, 6 months later, a year later, 2 months later, how did that work out? How did that work out? Across the board from them, I get the following answers. I get mostly, yeah, well. Then I get some, yeah, not so wells. But then I always get, that was a home run, Marty. That acquisition was a home run, right? And if I had asked them all to tell me where each acquisition was going to be at closing, they all would have put them in the home run category, right? But part of this is hitting timing and learning, right? And so I think for folks who are maybe made an acquisition or thinking about acquisitions, I think you have to be ready to stay with it. It's typically not one acquisition and you're done to be successful. It's typically a longer term plan and strategy that works out. Jeremy, shifting to you, it's not all, it's not easy, right? This isn't easy. So maybe you can talk about some of the frustrations and dangers of going down the acquisition path, and to do it to the novices, but maybe throw in some comments for folks who are serial acquirers as well.
Yeah, great. I think, it's just I've got a couple of frustrations that I think if you're out there doing deals, I think one very common one recently, particularly for those that are typically serial acquirers and have had a history of success, which is as a buyer losing out on deals and losing out even though you think you're overpaying or paying a very fair value for a business or offering to pay. And so I think, I don't know if I have a great solution to that other than to say that, look, it's been tough to be a buyer. I think some that have been quote unquote successful at acquiring some of these businesses, they may look a year or two later and say, look, we overpaid, or, we really would have been better served having a little bit less cash at close, a little bit more earn out, so we could have kind of de-risked the deal a little bit. So I think, that's maybe just one thought or, kind of heads up going in, which is in a competitive deal market, which we continue to be in. If you're losing deals, sometimes that's the best move for your business, right? I always say that a really good due diligence process either confirms that there's a good acquisition you found, or it kills a bad deal quickly. I think, to say that you've got to keep, you got to overpay or compete with the market inconsistent with your criteria or your strategy, I think that's usually a bad decision. So, that's one thing. I think another frustration for, I think, any deal is delays, right? And, that's one thing where time kills deals is the way we typically say in the industry, and momentum is critical, right? So, one recommendation is, as a buyer, as soon as you sign that letter of intent, what I would highly recommend is having what we call a kickoff call with the seller's management team, get everyone on the phone, come up with a very timeline-driven, milestone-driven process. Here's where we're going to start our legal diligence. Here's where we're going to start our financial diligence or our quality of earnings. And by the way, we're going to put at the end of this a target close date. So everyone hears it. It's a date on the calendar. It's not sometime in November or in a couple of months or 30 to 90 days. So I think, delays can really be a challenge and can be frustrating for buyers. And so I think having a good process around that is important. Maybe one other kind of topic to bring up is, as a buyer with an investment banking led sale process, that's where I think you see the most competition. You see, as a buyer, you've got to compete with a higher value, typically more cash at close. So I think finding ways to identify potential sellers who, are not running as competitive a process or may have other critical points to them, like the treatment of the team post-close. They want to get out quickly. Try to find opportunities where you're competing, not just on value. And sometimes the way to do that is you find a seller, develop a relationship on a one-off basis, develop trust, and negotiate a deal with a business owner directly, as opposed to as part of a competitive process.
John, from your perspective, why do deals fail? Because you have to know why they fail before you start, right? So that you can try and avoid those mistakes. From your experience, why do you see deals fail?
I would agree with Jeremy. Time kills all deals. So having a timely process is very, very important. Understanding the components, and I'm going to talk to the new buyer here, somebody that maybe they've made their first acquisition or haven't made one, and they're thinking about it. It's very important that you do not go alone. To me, you need good counsel. You need good legal counsel on the front end, and this is not your labor attorney or somebody that you've used for years in the firm. That may be where you gravitate, but you really need somebody with M&A experience that understands that M&A process. Marty's done a great job in that over the years with his firm. Jeremy, UHY, they've done a great job. So it's not only having the legal, but also the financial, the counsel, because there are many nuances, whether it's a stock sale, asset sale, or buy, and what are the tax ramifications. There's many elements that enter into it. So anyway, that's the time, and that's I think the new buyer having that preparation is important, and understanding the process. So that's a key element. I think to your point, Jeremy, finding those opportunities that may not be quite as competitive is a good strategy. Being able to develop that relationship. And even on the sell side, I tell my folks, I said, the financial aspects are one piece of the picture, the enterprise value, but the terms are so critical to making a deal happen. So, it's important as a new buyer that you're really listening, and yes, you're spending a good amount of money, whatever it happens to be for your size firm, but at the same time, really listen to that seller, and what is it what are the keys? What lights them up? You made the comment earlier. Is the owner want to stay? Do they want to leave quickly? They willing to transition? Who's the number two person? Et cetera, et cetera. So all of those are really important aspects of looking at it. But I think one of the big frustrations also, and for any buyer, whether it's a serial buyer or the new buyer, are the seller expectations. They're going to get frustrated because the seller has unrealistic expectations if they do not have good counsel on that side. So sometimes, bringing those two together takes time. It takes a dialogue. But I understand, a buyer being frustrated. The seller doesn't understand the market. He doesn't understand the risks that we're taking, et cetera. So I see that occur, and it takes time to work through that. And hopefully the seller has appropriate counsel that's guiding them to say, okay, no, I know you want 100% cash, but you're not going to get 100% cash. Let's have a different dialogue here if you really want to sell your business. And so we go from there.
And I think piggybacking on the time kills all deals. And that's why, a lot of sellers, this is their life's creation, and parting with it is a difficult thing to do. And buyers have to always keep that in the back of their mind, and they have to be ready to move, because sometimes hesitation makes the seller hesitate and change their mind. I want to talk a little bit more about search strategies. But I want to first add one more comment on why I've seen deals. And I'm going to talk about, you're talking about why deals don't close, the two of you. I want to talk about that kind of retrospective conversation I have with my clients, and I ask them, well, okay, you made the acquisition. Why wasn't it what you thought it would be? So I'm going to go there for a couple seconds. And they always tell me a couple of things. And these are serial acquirers. They say, we lost discipline in the transaction. That's the first one. They say, our glasses were too rosy in evaluating the transaction. And then the one they say most often is, we just didn't integrate it well. Right. So those are the three things when you're talking about not why a deal doesn't close, but why it's not successful. That's what they tell me. And with respect to that, the discipline that they talk about could be anywhere in the process. It could be, this was really outside of our strategy, the criteria that Jeremy was talking about setting early on. I think in his first response, it really was outside of that. Our target evaluation process, we kind of lost discipline, and we didn't really go through our scorecards thoroughly. Or, we were just super busy when we made this acquisition, and we didn't really go through our integration process well. So that leads to kind of a key thing, and why, again, my saying is in for a penny, in for a pound, because you learn, right? That's where you can learn as you're making more acquisitions and end up with a better result. And then rose-colored glasses, I always say, you're talking about teams, there has to be a skeptic on the team. People don't understand, but there has to be a skeptic on the acquisition team.
Really good.
Because If there's not, the tendency is if you've made that commitment to make acquisitions, the tendency is you want to make an acquisition, and you're going to lose your discipline, and you're going to get the rose-colored glasses on. So you have to have a skeptic on, and the biggest place you have to be skeptical is during the target evaluation. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, so I'll stop it there. But you need that skeptic from when you find the target, that you're in those discussions, who's gonna really say, what about this? I don't think that assumption is right. I don't think we can meet that, right? If we don't meet that, look what this looks like. That person has to be part of the team. And then integration. I mean, folks who do this well have great processes to integrate their acquisitions, right? Culturally, technology, seamlessly, how they're going to maximize their sales, how they're going to make that criteria that they set out at first really come to life. It's all through the integration process. Search strategies, John, though, I mean, Jeremy started to talk about them. I mean, you have to talk about the TechServe marketplace. I mean, it's a great place for folks to shop for acquisitions, let's be honest. So why don't you talk about that, and then some other places where folks can search for targets.
Thank you, Marty. Yes, the TechServe marketplace is a great place to look for opportunities. Very simply, we have over 80 buyer profiles. So buyers sign up. Oftentimes they are first-time buyers. Fill out a simple profile. This is what I'm looking for. So it's I'll say a first cut at what their search strategy is at that particular point in time. So TechServe is one place. I know there are other areas. SIA puts out a list of an annual buyers list. So that's a good place to get your name out there if you're a new buyer. The serial buyers are already on that list. I can assure you, the large folks are already on the SIA list. So that's a good one. There are numerous brokers that deal in the staffing industry. So those brokers are very active, and many of them are very, very good, provide a very solid service. So they always are looking for, they usually are on the sell side. So they're looking for good buyers. So that's a way to get your name out there. Investment bankers. Sometimes the investment bankers are dealing with the larger scenarios or larger opportunities, but at the same time, they run across a lot of opportunities that may not be a fit for them, maybe not the right size, et cetera. So, it's still a good way to network within the industry. And I always used my peer groups, the CEO roundtables that you're a member of, maybe the national meetings that you go to, like the TechServe conference is coming up in November. I know there's a lot of discussion, a lot of dialogue that takes place, in the corridors and in the, the coffee shops and the, whatever it happens to be. So that's another good place to, look for opportunities. So I think the key is always be looking. If you have the attitude that, okay, well, I'm ready to make an acquisition and I'm just going to do X, whatever X is, it's going to be very difficult to be successful. You need to have a pretty broad strategy for looking and searching, as long as you have a very narrow criteria for what it is you want to find.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's energy and effort and discipline, and if you don't have all three of those in this marketplace, it's going to be hard. Jeremy, you I know represent folks on the buy side in helping them find targets. Talk about some of the work that you do with your clients, what you find successful, what works for you in terms of locating targets for your clients.
Yeah, I think as John mentioned, TechServe, great resource. There's a lot of great resources out there where if you're a buyer, can get connected with sellers in the market today. I think, one of the services that we provide, we call it a buy-side search process. We find these to be very valuable to staffing companies that are looking to grow through acquisition. And I'd say maybe the one reason is because I think a lot of as you're kind of starting off, maybe you've kind of done everything on the criteria front and you figured out, all right, here's what I'm looking for. And then you sort of, let's say you come up with that list of companies that fit the majority of those aspects of what you're looking for. The next thing you have to do is you've got to reach out to these firms. And one of the things that I've seen occur is that, the CEO, the owner, the president, senior management teams, they start picking up the phone, and what they find out is they're getting a lot of no's. Thanks for calling. I'm not interested in selling. Thanks for calling. Now is not the right time. And so what ends up happening after a few of those phone calls, let's pass that along to, our business development team or mid-level management. And next thing you know, they make about 10 of those phone calls, and, 9 of those people don't want them to call them back. And it's frustrating. And what I see is that there's burnout in the process. And next thing you know, you don't really have an active growth through acquisition strategy. And so one of the things that we help business owners and management teams do is we offload a lot of that work, right? So we're basically, it's starting with the criteria phase, right? We're making sure those meetings are happening, making sure, Marty, to your point, that we've got, folks that are asking the tough questions. Is this really something we need? Can we really grow on the West Coast if we're East Coast focused today? Is that a little bit too much for us for the first acquisition? But I think one of the best things that we can do is sort of take some of that frustration off the plate. Whereas, we kind of have a very well-oiled machine and process where we're reaching out to these groups, we're following up with emails, phone calls, voicemails. We're looking to get no's, and it's just a part of what we do. And so it does kind of take some of that off. I think the other thing that we've talked about a bit today is seller value expectations. This is maybe a little bit off topic, but relative to the process that we like to run, I think, you've got to kind of have the end game in mind to some degree. So when you find a nice target, kind of fits all the parameters, you have an initial dialogue. I think sort of having a plan in place to getting to a proposal as a buyer quickly is really important, because again, if a business is worth 6 times EBITDA and, you propose, 5.5 to 6.5 to the seller, and they say, no, I think my business is worth 10. We want to find that out right away. You don't want to spend 3 months doing due diligence only to find out that you could have asked the question early on. And so that's also part of our buy-side search process, which is, we kind of do a lot of the grunt work and the part of the process that is not fun, but also help to make sure we're driving efficiency in the process. I think maybe my last quick point here goes back to something that Marty mentioned, which is doing a number of deals is really important. And I think one of the ways I kind of look at that is, after your first deal, as a team, as a management team, you've learned a lot. You've learned a lot of what works, what doesn't work, what we're going to do again next time, what we're definitely not going to do again next time. And you build that M&A muscle. So on the second deal, certainly the third deal, the team gets more reps and more experience nailing that criteria phase, right? Asking the right questions, knowing how to get a proposal pulled together quickly, just getting overall, corporate alignment on the strategy and making the process as efficient as possible.
I think that's a good point. To me, just to piggyback, I don't remember, I think it was John who mentioned this about networking, right? Kind of what I'd call grassroots approach. A lot of the folks that we work with are just really good at networking, and they're at the TechServe Alliance National Conference. They're at the regional and local TechServe Alliance meetings. They're at SIA Executive Health. I have one client that formed his own study group and brought in other, this is in the healthcare staffing industry, before each SIA healthcare forum, they would go together a day before, and he would invite some other folks in that were his competitors, and they would do a little study group. Well, he ended up buying 4 of his study group members. And that's why he started that study group, was for those opportunities. So, there's a lot of ways that you can go out and try and identify targets. And I think from hearing from the two of you, and I agree, it's just having the energy and the effort to keep out there. John, what are you up against in the marketplace today? I mean, you're right in it at the TechServe Alliance marketplace. What are buyers facing in terms of trying to find targets today? What does it look like?
I think there are plenty of targets. I think consistency is a big part of it. So I think as a new buyer, I hate to use the adage, but you're going to kiss a lot of frogs to find the prince. So you really need to have the energy and have the discipline to be looking at multiple opportunities. So I don't think there's a problem finding the opportunities. The challenge is, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, is making sure we find the right opportunity. Kind of a comment that goes along with that. I think one of the challenges, especially for a new buyer in the marketplace, do they have they set aside the internal time or personnel to pursue? Oftentimes I see fits and starts. Okay, we spend a couple of weeks on it. Well, we didn't find anybody, so it goes fallow, it goes quiet. I know when I had my own firm, I had a partner, thankfully, and we finally figured out through trial and error that, one of us has to focus on that totally. So he ran the day-to-day operations, and I went searching for companies and talking to the banks and financial people, all that type of stuff. So you have to have the discipline to continue the pursuit, and you're going to talk to a lot of people that it may come for naught, but you're learning in that process. So you're gaining intellectual knowledge, for your own organization that's better for the next one. So I think as a new buyer, having that internal discipline to continue that quest on a consistent basis is absolutely critical. And because you can't take too much time away from your current operations, and maybe if you're a first-time buyer, whose responsibility is that? Is it the CEO? Do you have a business development person? My VP of sales or my COO or whatever it happens to be. So understanding whose primary responsibility and who's being held accountable for it, and what resources do they need from the organization to move that forward.
I think all of the firms that I think are very successful at this just build it in as part of their operations, right? You've got your recruiters, you got your compliance folks, you got your accountants, and then you got your folks designated to this process. And there may be some overlap, but it just has to be built into the operations. Let's shift into our last topic, and this is where I think we'll dive a little bit deeper. Target evaluation. And we've hinted at it a little bit throughout this conversation and scratched the surface, but I really do want to jump in, wholeheartedly. And I think the place where I start is going back to what you said, Jeremy. This is, relates to the criteria you set during your strategy, right? So you have to turn that to me. I've been lucky enough to be on some evaluation committees for some clients, especially early on in their acquisition, processes. They're making their first couple, and all the ones that do it well create a scorecard, I call it, and they take that criteria you were talking about that they set as their strategy, what their goals were, what they're trying to accomplish, and they create a scorecard to evaluate their targets. And usually, and they all look different, but usually they have some things in common from what I've seen. And there's always two aspects to it. There's what I call the financial scorecard and kind of the intangible scorecard, right? Those are what I see. And the financial scorecard is what I call a pro forma, right? They take a look and they're going to evaluate the target's financials and see if it fits into the criteria, right? Are their margins the same, or they have completely different margins? Their margins are a lot lower. How are we dealing with that, right? So there's a financial analysis of the target. Then there's a financial analysis of what's the combination going to look like when we roll those folks in. That there's pro forma calculations of that. And that's where we start looking at, and I know Jeremy and John, I'm going to ask you guys to talk about this a little bit more. We start to talk about revenue and cost synergies, right? So we're going to buy their EBITDA, and hopefully it's all going to come over. But if there's revenue synergies, we're going to grow that, right? Rolling in those revenue and cost synergies that you're going to talk about and coming up with, okay, now this is what the combined organization looks like. And does that make our criteria? So that's the financial scorecard in kind of a really abbreviated version. Then you have the intangible scorecard. And, you know, what's the location? What's the culture? Really important. What's the culture? Is it the same as ours? Involved in a transaction. It was funny. I was this wasn't even in my mind when we were going to speak today, but Jeremy, you talked about being an East Coast. I think your example was I'm an East Coast staffing firm and I'm going to buy a West Coast staffing firm. Well, 4 or 5 years ago in the tech staffing industry, I was representing a seller, West Coast seller, very, very professional, buttoned up East Coast PE firm. We had a very casual, open West Coast IT staffing firm, and the East Coast PE firm bought the West Coast staffing firm, and they would never admit it, but I'm going to say it. It was a disaster culturally. People left, and it just wasn't a cultural fit. So what's your culture? And is their culture close? Technology, right? That's an intangible. How's that going to work? Compliance. I have a number of clients on the buy side who are very compliance oriented. And so they're only going to look for firms that are likewise compliant oriented. I have one buyer who is less compliance oriented. And, you know, he doesn't really care as much about what the target's compliance looks like. So, you know, that's kind of the intangible scorecard. Again, I've simplified both, but that to me is the start of target valuation. I don't know, Jeremy, your thoughts on the evaluation process and some things that you really recommend when folks finally have found somebody to speak to and are trying to figure out if it's the right company to buy.
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of it there. I think it does go back to process, right? Having a scorecard, I mean, that's step number one. And I think as we've talked about throughout the day, it's bringing in folks, you know, so, you know, who's going to kind of evaluate that scorecard, right? Sort of your M&A team. But to your point, Marty, you know, if there's some technology similarities, which is a plus on the scorecard, and if there's some differences, there's going to be some integration challenges or some software update requirements. Pull in folks from IT, right? It doesn't have to be a full team, but get someone on your M&A team that can represent the IT function of the business. They're going to know better, you know, what the solution looks like. So I think as it relates to your scorecard, whether it's financial, quantitative, or qualitative topics, you know, some categories are going to rate very well. That's good. Some are going to rate lower than others. And, you know, in those categories, I think then you got to dig in and figure out, well, what's the solution? What's the risk there? How do we mitigate the risk? It might be via a lower purchase price, right? The company just has lower margins, and that is what it is. Or maybe it's this target company has lower margins. We know why. We have resources that can fix that. And so we've got kind of a solution on our side ready to roll there. Or is it are there some hires we need to make to run that organization better or more efficiently? So I think it's making sure you've got the scorecard, making sure everyone that's evaluating that scorecard, make sure you have the right people in the room to do that, to get through that exercise completely. And then just for every aspect where it isn't on a 10 scale, if it's a 5 or below, really dig in and figure out, is this a deal killer? Can we create a solution easily? Can we create a solution, but it's going to take us a year and a lot of hard work, and there's risk there? And then if that's the case, how do we de-risk that piece of the deal for ourselves? It may be deal structure, it may be in performance-based earnout, a whole host of things. But I think it's just being very strategic in your process about the scorecard piece of this. And to your point, Marty, be disciplined. The point in the deal where it's easiest to lose discipline is at the 11th hour. Both the buyer and the seller are sort of thinking, well, you know, I've invested all this time, energy, effort, and resources. You know, I just found out that, you know, margins are actually 1% lower than I've been thinking the whole time. We'll just close over that. Well, that's tempting. But I think just being disciplined, especially near the end, everyone's invested a lot of time and effort and energy, but as a buyer, you own that deal, you own the outcome. Marty, a lot of strong stories, a lot of negative stories, and you have to own that piece of it. So just making sure that you're staying disciplined throughout the process from start to close and post close.
John, I'd love to have you add, and then I'd love to have you tackle either revenue synergies or cost synergies, one of those two, and just make sure everybody understands what they are and the importance of considering those in target evaluation.
Yeah, I'll touch on both of those, Marty, from a revenue and cost standpoint. One thing, kind of a foundation that I want to lay right here, is that as a buyer and you're creating that scorecard, oftentimes people want somebody that looks exactly like us. Okay, so the tendency is, okay, well, I want another company to acquire that looks just like us. And it may be appropriate, but then again, I'd caution you to have a little broader mind, be a little more open on that opportunity. On the revenue is a good example. Where is that revenue coming from? Is it the traditional face-to-face customer? If that's my business profile and I'm looking at a target that has VMS, okay, or MSP business, is that an automatic, we may have put on our scorecard, I don't want that business because it's lower margin. Well, we need to be taking a look at that. Is that really the appropriate way to look at it in the scorecard? That revenue, can I accrue that revenue and reduce my overall cost? So it may be a different type of revenue stream, but at the same time, it may accrue other benefits, to the organization. So look at revenue there. You made the comment earlier, firms are targeting the direct hire firms. So does the firm have direct hire that can improve the margin? So they may have some traditional revenue, which is at lower margin, but they also have a good solid foundation for direct hire or perm placement, depending upon your terminology, that helps enhance the overall gross margin. So I'd be taking a look at that. So different types of revenue streams. From the cost standpoint, this is oftentimes a challenge. There should be some costs to be reduced, as say, maybe not necessarily reduced, but the overall cost should accrue to that buyer as far as, overall reduction, which should improve my operating income or my net income line. So it could be in the services that I'm providing internally. Could very well be that as a buyer, I already have the infrastructure all set up that I can integrate additional transactional volume into my business with no increase in cost. That may allow me to reduce it on the seller side. So that's something, but to the comment earlier, you have to have a very good disciplined integration plan in order for that to take place. The other thing that I would be looking at in the revenue cost synergies, look at your target. So as a buyer, you're very comfortable with your process. You're very comfortable that it's efficient. You've worked at that over the years, and you're producing a good bottom line. There may be something to be learned from that seller. They may have a process that you don't have that you could actually integrate. Kind of the reverse. They're doing it differently than we do, and wow, it looks like it may be more efficient. So I would encourage you to look at cost synergies from the other side as you go about it.
That's a great
areas
point.
I'd be looking at.
Oh, sorry, John. I thought you had finished.
No, I am.
Okay. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that, with revenue synergies and cost synergies, I think again, and I keep using the same phrase, I think that's where folks tend to overestimate, right? They look at the revenue synergies and they say, oh, well, we're going to turn X to Y, and that's easy. All we have, or the cost synergies, we're going to be able to get rid of these 4 or 5 people, and our overall accrued expenses are going to be lower. I think that you have to be really disciplined with that. I know some of our clients who will, have their peers. For instance, one client has peer serial acquirers in other industries, right, that they talk to. And one of the things they talk about is, when have you overestimated your revenue synergies, and why did you overestimate your revenue synergy? What caused you? What did you learn? Because it's, that can tend to be the tendency. So I think that's really important, because that's an area where, hey, that's where you can hit the home run, right? Where I talked about earlier, I opened up with, did well on this one, maybe not so well on this one. Oh my God, home run here. That's where you hit the home run, but that's also where you can have the didn't do so well. So I think last question, and then we'll open it up for questions. And this is to take it wherever you want to go. Jeremy, why don't you start off? Just, share something you haven't shared so far in this conversation that you think is really important for folks to think about.
Love the question, Marty, because I was thinking, so I think John brought something up earlier on, and I wrote a note to mention the word emotions, right? Because I think as it comes to M&A and as a buyer, investment bankers, we're thinking, financials and accounting and negotiation and deal strategy. But at the end of the day, there's another human being on the other side of this deal. The seller, particularly for, smaller family-owned companies, I'd say oftentimes 80% of deals are emotion and only about 20% are financial. And, sometimes this is it's like a member of the family to them. So just know your audience and, listen, what's important to you. Because at the end of the day, the challenge is with any deal, there's going to be some things you find out in diligence as a buyer where you got to go back to that business owner and say, hey, look, I know I agreed to, a $15 million purchase price, but I didn't know, we had this piece of the cost structure is going to increase next year. And here, so you want to create that pathway towards good communication, good lines of communication, building trust, because there are emotional pieces of deals that can kill a deal at the 11th hour. It's an exhausting process. A lot of deals can take all of 6 months or longer. And as a business owner that hasn't been through this before, as a seller, they're going to be tired by the time we're getting close to the closing time. So just keeping in mind that emotions are really critical in these processes, and just think of ways to keep that active dialogue, keep that trust, because things are going to occur from time to time in a deal that it's going to be very valuable.
John, your turn.
Yeah, I would agree with Jeremy. He made a comment about communication, and it's a joint communication process on both sides. On the seller, they need to be very transparent in the information they're providing, because it's going to come out in due diligence. The sellers do not understand the level of due diligence that's required in a successful transaction. As Jeremy said, everyone's tired as you get towards the end. So that joint communication. Also, to the emotional aspect, virtually every deal that I've been involved with, there is emotion involved, and it's generally not over the money. It's over the people. And the owner, they want to make sure that their team's being taken care of. They really have a heart. Like you said, it's a member of the family. So as a result of that communication, and from a buyer standpoint, how you're treating people is oh so important. Yes, there's a check being written and money being transferred, all that type of thing. But it really is about people. And if you'll remember that as a buyer, you'll have a much better opportunity to having a successful transaction on your hands.
I think that's leads pretty nicely into what my closing comment is. I think that the buyers sometimes don't understand themselves well enough. And I see this in two ways. on tangible and intangible. I've worked on the tangible and the financial. I've worked with a buyer who was making acquisitions under the assumption that when he transitioned and he sold, he had a certain value. And, you know, that value wasn't quite correct. It was overstated. And he did very well, don't get me wrong, but if he had his value correct, his own company value, he probably would have had a little bit different pricing strategy for his acquisitions and would have done even a little bit better. And this is, I mean, these folks did really well, but if I've talked to them and they've said, you know what, we slightly overestimated what our value was going to be, and so we were slightly overpaying for all of our targets. So really, you know yourself. And then the same thing that goes with the intangible. Like John, you picked it up, right? There are things that you can pick up from your sellers, processes, talents, people that are better than yours, right? Be open to that, and look for that. And then also really understand your culture. Some buyers don't really understand their culture. They think they have a certain culture, and maybe they don't. And then, you know, when they acquire, they don't evaluate the culture of the other company as well, and whether or not that'll be a fit as well as they should. So, you know, my advice is there's a lot of introspection that has to take place if you're going to be on the buy side. So I don't think we have time for Q&A now, unfortunately. Put a lawyer in charge of anything, and you're always going to have a little bit too much talking. I apologize to the audience for that. But I know John and I know Jeremy and me as well. So if you do have any questions, you know, I'm always happy to spend some time with TechServe community and answer questions off the clock. I know Jeremy is, and John is never off the clock for TechServe. So any one of us will be happy to answer any questions. And with that, I'm going to send it back over to you, Angie.
A big thank you to Marty, Jeremy, and John, and thank you all for joining. We ask that you please fill out the survey upon exiting this webinar. Our next scheduled webinar will be State of the Industry, an executive webinar series on Tuesday, October 11th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Also, just a reminder that this year's Executive Summit is scheduled for November 7th through 9th at the La Quinta Resort in Palm Springs, California. Please send any further questions to staff@techservealliance.org. Thank you and have a wonderful day.